This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 364, entitled Soundbites for Media Masculists. This is part 2. Carrying straight on. Women are hypergamous, that is, they have the female instinct to mate up, wanting the superior DNA of a superior male for her kids, so that her kids are smarter than she is, which is obviously good for the species, so is inherited. All women have this hypergamous instinct. Men have only one X chromosome in their cells, so express more recessive genes than women do with their 2 X chromosomes, so that the dominant gene on one X chromosome switches off the corresponding recessive gene on the other X chromosome. There are more recessive genes than dominant genes. Thus men are more varied over a whole population, which causes the phenomenon of GMV, that's greater male variance. So that in IQ terms, the morons and the genii are males. Given the genii are males, it's not surprising that men win 99% of the science Nobel Prizes and the math prizes. Since women have been sexually selecting men who are smarter than them, it's not surprising that men have an average IQ that is 4 IQ points higher than women's. Thus men are the superior sex in many respects, and this male superiority was largely caused by women's sexual preferences in men over thousands of generations. Masculists tell feminists that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, because women's oppression of men is so deep, so sustained, lasting decades. For example, look at women's financial parasitism of men, women's man-slavery, the fluffy feminist hypocrisy in the divorce courts, women's red pill nature, that is, not loving men for themselves, but for men's sexploitability by women, who evolved to be able to coldly, quickly, disloyally dump a man who loses his ability to be a manslave to a woman. She then gives her vagina to a more sexploitable man. Women have always been parasites of men because they could not hunt. They were stuck at home taking care of useless human infants. Women thus evolved to be prostitutes to men, becoming the sexiest of mammals, with every day of the month being in sexual heat, unlike female dogs or female monkeys. Hence were better able to bribe men with sex in exchange for scarce male hunted meat, especially in times of starvation. Masculists push for the creation of a FIP society, in which young women are socialized by parents and educated by teachers and professors to become FIPs, to pull their own financial weight, so that men can be freed from the decades-long oppression of being manslaves to women, freed from the hated fluffies and fluffy feminist hypocrites. With all women FIPs, the legislation of the para becomes much more practical. Masculists push for the fipping of women, or that women be threatened with babylessness. Masculists use slogans such as "be fip or be manless," "no calculus, no baby." Masculists want the divorce courts to be made men fair, similarly with the para and with many other gender crimes that women commit against men. Millions of women lie to their boyfriends and husbands about taking the pill, whereas in reality they want to get pregnant, do so, then force their man to pay for a kid he does not want. This is a major gender crime against men, hence the need for the para. The fact that women have the mara but men don't have the para screams out against the gender injustice committed against men. Masculists push for feminists to become bi-conscious, that is, to be both conscious of how men oppress women, that is, have their feminist consciousness raised, and to be conscious of how women oppress men, that is, have their masculist consciousness raised. Bi-conscious feminists are much more likely to have boyfriends, since they have their feminist anger at men more or less cancelled by a corresponding and oppositely directed masculist anger at women. Those monoconscious feminists who refuse to acknowledge that gender oppression is a two-way street are labelled MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots, by the Masculists, who hurl abuse at MFBs, which is the masculist equivalent of the term MCP, male chauvinist pig, of the feminists in the 60s and 70s. Masculists have a real hatred for the fluffy feminists for what they are doing in the divorce courts, becoming indirect genociders. Modern marriage is now such a shitty deal for men that in many countries now, 2/3 of young men refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves. Masculists tell young women that the root cause of why quality young men refuse to give them their sperm is due to the fluffy feminist takeover of the divorce courts, making them so toxic that young men tell each other not to marry, not to have kids. Masculists tell young women to hate the fluffy feminists for causing them to be babyless, so that the fluffy feminist hypocrites are hated by both sexes and will be wiped out. Since such a high proportion of young men now reject paternity, for example, the birth rate in South Korea is now under 1 child per woman, whereas the replacement rate is 2.1 children per woman. In brackets, the fluffy feminists are seen by the masculists as indirect genociders who have to be stopped, either with bullets or by destroying the core ideas of monoconscious feminism. Responsible males, masculist soldiers, will not tolerate that the feminazis wipe out whole populations. Instead, masculist soldiers will simply go out into the streets and shoot these feminazi vermin. The more benign alternative is to use masculist arguments to destroy third-wave feminism, which aims to empower women at men's expense. For example, the deeply misandrist behaviour of the fluffy feminist hypocrites in the divorce courts. MFBs, monoconscious feminazi bigots, have become indirect genociders, wiping out whole populations, so have to be stopped. That is the job of the masculists. MFBs will either become bi-conscious or they will be shot by the masculists in a sex war in order to prevent whole populations from dying out. End quote. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 360 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.